Before any quotation, before any citation, let us make sure we agree on what is actually being asked, because the question of this lecture hides inside arguments you have heard 100 times. When someone says, the problem is not capitalism, the problem is that the state stopped regulating the banks. When someone says, elect us and we will tax the billionaires and make the corporations behave. When someone says, China is socialist, because there the state commands the capitalists and not the other way around. All three of these are, underneath, one and the same claim, that the state is a power standing above the economy, that capital is a tool, a resource, perhaps a dangerous animal, but in any case something a sufficiently determined government can hold, direct, and keep on a leash. This lecture examines that claim scientifically and defends the opposite one, that capital is not a thing to be held, but a social relation and a social power, and that wherever capital persists, it takes hold of the whole of society, including of the state itself. Notice what is at stake. If the claim of our opponents is true, then the task of the workers' movement is to capture and steer the existing state. If it is false, then a century of strategy built upon it, reformist, regulatory, and revisionist alike, rests on an error about what capital is. So we must begin at the beginning with definitions. Who exactly are we answering? 3 schools, and we shall introduce each one fairly before any polemic. The first is the liberal, together with his corporatist cousin. He believes in the referee state, antitrust law, central banks, independent courts, tripartite commissions where government, employers, and unions negotiate the national interest. Capital for him is like a strong horse that needs a firm rider and good fences. The second is the social democrat. He goes further. The state should not merely referee but redistribute, tax the great fortunes, build the welfare system, perhaps nationalize the railways and the power grid, and thereby domesticate capitalism from within, generation by generation, ballot by ballot. The third, and for this lecture the most important, is the modern revisionist of the dengist type. He says, a communist party holds the state. It admits private capital, foreign investment, and the market as instruments to develop the productive forces. And because the party commands the state, the capital it admits remains forever a bird in a cage, singing but never escaping. 3 schools, 3 vocabularies, 1 shared premise, that the state stands above the economy and can hold capital from outside. Our thesis is that this premise mistakes what capital is, and therefore what the state is. To show that, we need the definitions themselves. A word on method, because the method is itself part of the argument. Marxism has been buried twice, once by its enemies and once by its self-declared friends, who quote its name and omit its content. Against both, the anti-revisionist tradition has always used one and the same instrument, the long, exact, verifiable quotation. That is how Lenin wrote The State and Revolution, and it is how this lecture proceeds. Every substantive claim you are about to hear rests on a passage of Marx, Engels, or Lenin quoted word for word, with the work, the chapter, and the year named aloud, and every source is freely available on the Marxists' Internet Archive, so that you can and should check each one against the original. Where this lecture and the texts differ, trust the texts. The road we shall travel is this. Parts 1 and 2 establish what capital is. Not a thing, but a relation and a power. Parts 3 and 4 establish what the state is and whose it is. Part 5 answers the objection that state ownership changes everything. Part 6 answers the social democrat. Part 7 the dengist. Part 8 the liberal and the corporatist. The conclusion states what follows, that capital cannot be controlled, only abolished, and an appendix of extended readings deepens each point. That is the whole plan. Here, then, is the lecture. Capital, State, and Dominance. A proper scientific response to dengists, liberals, and corporatists. Introduction on icons and their restoration. In August of 1917, hiding from the police of the provisional government, Lenin set down the opening lines of The State and Revolution. He wrote, "What is now happening to Marx's theory has, in the course of history, happened repeatedly to the theories of revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes fighting for emancipation. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes constantly hounded them, received their theories with the most savage malice, the most furious hatred, and the most unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. After their death, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, and to hallow their names to a certain extent for the consolation of the oppressed classes, and with the object of duping the latter, while at the same time robbing the revolutionary theory of its substance, blunting its revolutionary edge and vulgarizing it. End quote. Footnote 1. Lenin, The State and Revolution, Chapter 1, Collected Works, Volume 25. Every quotation in this lecture is given word for word from the source named, as transcribed on the Marxists' Internet Archive, and every source is listed in the accompanying references document. Lenin continued, in these circumstances, in view of the unprecedentedly widespread distortion of Marxism, our prime task is to re-establish what Marx really taught on the subject of the state. This will necessitate a number of long quotations from the works of Marx and Engels themselves. End quote. We shall follow that method to the letter. The proposition this lecture defends is the following. Capital is not a thing which a state may hold in its hands and direct as it pleases. Capital is a social relation and a social power, the power of a part of society. And wherever capital persists, it takes hold of the whole of society, including of the state itself. From this it follows with necessity that no state, whatever banner it flies and whatever color it paints its ministries, can control or regulate capital in the sense our opponents intend. Three schools deny this. The social democrat, who believes that the ballot, the tax code, and the welfare office can tame capital. The liberal and the corporatist, who believe that the regulator, the tribunal, and the tripartite committee can leash it. And the modern revisionist, the dengist, who believes that a communist party can hold state power indefinitely while capital accumulates beneath it, a bird kept in a cage which never escapes. We shall answer all three. Not with indignation, but with the texts and with the science of Marxism-Leninism. Part 1. What capital is not. Let us begin where Marx began with the workers of Brussels in December of 1847 in the lectures published as Wage Labor and Capital. First, the definition given by the bourgeois economists. Marx states it thus: capital consists of raw materials, instruments of labor, and means of subsistence of all kinds, which are employed in producing new raw materials, new instruments, and new means of subsistence. All these components of capital are created by labor, products of labor, accumulated labor. Accumulated labor that serves as a means to new production is capital. So say the economists. End quote. And then Marx demolishes this definition in 4 sentences. What is a Negro slave? A man of the black race. The one explanation is worthy of the other. A Negro is a Negro. Only under certain conditions does he become a slave. A cotton spinning machine is a machine for spinning cotton. Only under certain conditions does it become capital. Torn away from these conditions, it is as little capital as gold is itself money, or sugar is the price of sugar. End quote. Mark this well, for the whole dispute hangs upon it. The machine, the factory, the port, the fund of money, none of these is capital by nature. They become capital only within a definite social condition. What condition? That is the entire question. Marx answers. In the process of production, human beings work not only upon nature, but also upon one another. They produce only by working together in a specified manner and reciprocally exchanging their activities. In order to produce, they enter into definite connections and relations to one another, and only within these social connections and relations does their influence upon nature operate, that is, does production take place. End quote. And further, the relations of production in their totality constitute what is called the social relations, society, and moreover a society at a definite stage of historical development, a society with peculiar distinctive characteristics. Ancient society, feudal society, bourgeois or capitalist society are such totalities of relations of production, each of which denotes a particular stage of development in the history of mankind. End quote. And now the decisive sentence, footnote 4. Capital also is a social relation of production. It is a bourgeois relation of production, a relation of production of bourgeois society. End quote. Not a warehouse of things, not a sum in a ledger, a relation between classes of living human beings, which the things merely carry, as paper carries writing. Whoever speaks of controlling capital while preserving it speaks of controlling a relation while reproducing it daily on an extended scale. 20 years later, in the 33rd chapter of the first volume of Capital, Marx returned to this discovery and gave it its classical form by way of the colonial theorist Edward Gibbon Wakefield. Marx writes, "First of all, Wakefield discovered that in the colonies, property and money, means of subsistence, machines, and other means of production, does not as yet stamp a man as a capitalist, if there be wanting the correlative, the wage worker, the other man who is compelled to sell himself of his own free will. He discovered that capital is not a thing, but a social relation between persons, established by the instrumentality of things." End quote. And then the famous illustration, Mr. Peel, he moans, took with him from England to Swan River, West Australia, means of subsistence and of production to the amount of £50,000. Mr. Peel had the foresight to bring with him, besides, 300 persons of the working class, men, women, and children. Once arrived at his destination, Mr. Peel was left without a servant to make his bed or fetch him water from the river. Unhappy Mr. Peel, who provided for everything except the export of English modes of production to Swan River. End quote, footnote 5. Why was Mr. Peel left without a servant? Because in the colony there was free land, and the 300 laborers ceased to be laborers for hire the moment they could work for themselves. His £50,000 of means of production crossed the ocean intact, and yet his capital perished on the voyage, because capital is not the things but the relation, and the relation could not be exported. Marx draws the general law in the same chapter. We know that the means of production and subsistence, while they remain the property of the immediate producer, are not capital. They become capital only under circumstances in which they serve at the same time as means of exploitation and subjection of the laborer. End quote. Footnote 6. Here already the vulgar conception of our opponents is destroyed at the root. They imagine capital as a horse, and the question as merely who sits in the saddle, the private gentleman or the people's state. But capital is not the horse. Capital is the relation of horse and rider, of exploited and exploiter, of wage labor and appropriated surplus. One does not ride a relation. One either reproduces it or one abolishes it. There is no third seat. Part 2. Capital as an independent social power. We return to wage labor and capital for the passage upon which our whole thesis rests. Marx asks, how then does a sum of commodities of exchange values become capital? And he answers, thereby that as an independent social power, that is, as the power of a part of society, it preserves itself and multiplies by exchange with direct, living labor power. The existence of a class which possesses nothing but the ability to work is a necessary presupposition of capital. It is only the dominion of past, accumulated, materialized labor over immediate living labor that stamps the accumulated labor with the character of capital. Capital does not consist in the fact that accumulated labor serves living labor as a means for new production. It consists in the fact that living labor serves accumulated labor as the means of preserving and multiplying its exchange value. End quote. Footnote 7. An independent social power. The power of a part of society. Dead labor ruling living labor. This is Marx's own vocabulary, and we shall not soften it. Capital is a form of class power which exists before any parliament sits and after any parliament adjourns, because it is exercised every day in the workplace, in the labor market, in the movement of investment, without a single law being passed. Grasp what follows from this definition. First, capital is anonymous and impersonal. It does not need a wicked man in a top hat. Whoever administers it, a private owner, a shareholders' board, a state trust, stands under the same compulsion to preserve and multiply exchange value by the absorption of living labor, or to be devoured by rivals who do. Second, capital is expansive by essence. A capital which does not accumulate ceases to be capital. Therefore, the relation, wherever it is permitted to exist, grows, concentrates, and reaches for every branch of production, every territory, every institution which can secure its expansion. And third, capital is already a power before it touches politics. It commands the daily life of the class, which must sell its labor power in order to eat. It decides where investment goes and where famine of investment falls. It holds society hostage with the strike of capital, as no trade union ever held it with the strike of labor. Now pose the question of our opponents honestly. Can the state control capital? Translated into scientific language, the question reads, can the state stand above the most powerful part of society and command it while leaving it in possession of the very power by which it dominates society? To answer, we must know what the state is. Here the science of Marxism speaks with one voice. Part 3. What the state is. Lenin builds upon Engels' work of 1884, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, and quotes this summary. The state is, therefore, by no means a power forced on society from without. Just as little is it the reality of the ethical idea, the image and reality of reason, as Hegel maintains. Rather, it is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that it has split into irreconcilable antagonisms which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms, these classes with conflicting economic interests, might not consume themselves in society in fruitless struggle, it became necessary to have a power, seemingly standing above society, that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. And this power, arisen out of society, but placing itself above it and alienating itself more and more from it, is the state. End quote, footnote 9. Note the word seemingly. The state seems to stand above society, above the classes. Upon this seeming, every reformist illusion is built. Upon its exposure, every revolutionary science. Lenin draws the conclusion with perfect sharpness. The state is a product and a manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. The state arises where, when, and insofar as class antagonism objectively cannot be reconciled. And conversely, the existence of the state proves that the class antagonisms are irreconcilable. End quote. And he identifies the exact distortion which our social democratic opponents repeat today, 100 years on. From what the petty bourgeois and Philistine professors and publicists say, with quite frequent and benevolent references to Marx, it appears that the state does reconcile classes. According to Marx, the state is an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It is the creation of order, which legalizes and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the conflict between classes. End quote, footnote 10. The Social Democrats' entire program, arbitration between labor and capital, the social partnership, the round table of government, employers and unions, is in Lenin's words the petty bourgeois theory of reconciliation, which he answered in advance, that the state is an organ of the rule of a definite class which cannot be reconciled with its antipode, is something the petty bourgeois Democrats will never be able to understand. Whose state, then, is the state? Engels answers, as quoted by Lenin, because the state arose from the need to hold class antagonisms in check, but because it arose at the same time in the midst of the conflict of these classes, it is, as a rule, the state of the most powerful, economically dominant class, which, through the medium of the state, becomes also the politically dominant class, and thus acquires new means of holding down and exploiting the oppressed class. End quote. And of our own epoch, the modern representative state is an instrument of exploitation of wage labor by capital. End quote, footnote 11. Hold that first sentence before your eyes, for it is the law of motion of our entire subject. The economically dominant class, through the medium of the state, becomes also the politically dominant class. Not may become. Not sometimes becomes, as a rule becomes. Marx and Engels had said it already in the Manifesto of 1848. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. End quote. Where capital is the dominant economic power, the state is capital's organ. To ask such a state to control capital is to ask the committee to overthrow its own board of directors. But is not the democratic state different? Cannot the people, through elections, seize the machine and turn it against wealth? Lenin answered in the same chapter, a democratic republic is the best possible political shell for capitalism, and therefore, once capital has gained possession of this very best shell, it establishes its power so securely, so firmly, that no change of persons, institutions, or parties in the bourgeois democratic republic can shake it." End quote. Footnote 12. Mark the direction of the verb. It is not the republic which possesses capital. It is capital which gains possession of the republic. And Lenin adds, we must also note that Engels is most explicit in calling universal suffrage an instrument of bourgeois rule. Universal suffrage, he says, is the gauge of the maturity of the working class. It cannot and never will be anything more in the present-day state. End quote. Lenin names the mechanisms: the direct and indirect bribery of officials, the alliance of the government and the syndicates, the lucrative posts awaiting the pliable minister. These are not corruptions of the system, deviations to be reformed away. They are the system's normal metabolism, the daily circulation by which the social power of capital becomes state policy. Part 4. The epoch of imperialism, or capital in possession of the state. What was tendency in 1848 became completed system by 1916. In Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin documents with the statistics of the bourgeois economists themselves the ever-growing merger, or as Bukharin aptly calls it, coalescence, of bank and industrial capital into finance capital. And then this from Chapter 2. The personal link-up between the banks and industry is supplemented by the personal link-up between both of them and the government. Seats on supervisory boards, writes Geitels, are freely offered to persons of title, also to ex-civil servants, who are able to do a great deal to facilitate relations with the authorities. Usually, on the supervisory board of a big bank, there is a member of parliament or a Berlin city councillor. End quote. Footnote 13. The revolving door, as the moderns call it, was already turning in Berlin in 1905, and Lenin already understood it not as a scandal but as a structure, the interlacing of bank, trust, and ministry into a single apparatus of the financial oligarchy. Of Republican France, Lenin cites the writer Lysis. The French Republic is a financial monarchy. It is the complete domination of the financial oligarchy. The latter dominates over the press and the government. End quote. Footnote 14. Let us now state plainly what has been established by the texts. Capital is a social relation between classes and an independent social power, the power of a part of society which preserves and multiplies itself by the exploitation of living labor. The state is the organ of the economically dominant class, and the economically dominant class, through the medium of the state, becomes also the politically dominant class. In the epoch of imperialism, this taking hold is consummated in the personal link-up of banks, industry, and government. Therefore, capital, wherever it persists, takes hold of the whole of society, including of the state. This is not a slogan. It is the condensed conclusion of Wage Labor and Capital, of the 33rd chapter of Capital, of The Origin of the Family, of the Manifesto, of the State and Revolution, and of imperialism. Whoever wishes to refute it must refute them. Now we turn to the objections, and we take them in ascending order of seriousness: the liberal, the social democrat, and the dengist. Part 5. But what if the state itself owns the capital? Here the corporatist and the dengist believe they hold a trump. Let the state own the banks, the land, the commanding heights, and capital is thereby domesticated, made into an instrument of policy. Engels answered this objection in 1880, in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, and his answer deserves to be learned by heart. Quote, the modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of the total national capital. End quote. Footnote 15. The ideal personification of the total national capital. Engels does not say the state is capital's servant, hired and dismissible. He says something far stronger. Where the capital relation prevails, the state is the total national capital organized as a person, capital's own general committee, capital appearing in the costume of the universal interest. The question, can this state control capital, answers itself. Capital's ideal personification can no more suppress capital than a mirror can strangle the face reflected in it. It can discipline individual capitalists, bankrupt them, jail them, even shoot them. Capital as a relation it defends with its whole being, for that relation is its own foundation. Engels continues, and every word falls like a hammer on the theory of state-controlled capitalism. The more it proceeds to the taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist, the more citizens does it exploit. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. The capitalist relation is not done away with. It is rather brought to a head. End quote, footnote 16. Here's the criterion, and note that it is a class criterion, not a juridical one. Ask not, who holds the title deeds? Ask, do the workers remain wage workers? Is labor power still a commodity? Is surplus labor still appropriated by a power standing over the producers and accumulated as value commanding future labor? If yes, then the capital relation persists, whether the employer is called Krupp, or the Prussian State Railways, or a state-owned enterprise supervised by a commission of a communist party. And where the relation persists, by everything already demonstrated, it acts as capital. It accumulates, it concentrates, and it takes hold of the organs that administer it. Engels grants one thing. State ownership brings the contradiction to a head and conceals within it the technical elements of the solution. But the solution itself, he says, comes only when society openly and directly takes possession of the productive forces which have outgrown all control, except that of society as a whole. Part 6. The Social Democrat. In 1875, the United German Workers' Party wrote into its Gotha program the demand for a free state, a people's state which would stand above society and administer justice between the classes. Marx's marginal notes on that program are the founding document of the struggle against social democratic revisionism. He wrote, "Free state, what is this? It is by no means the aim of the workers, who have got rid of the narrow mentality of humble subjects, to set the state free. Freedom consists in converting the state from an organ superimposed upon society into one completely subordinate to it." End quote, footnote 17. The whole of social democracy stands condemned in that note. Its program, from Gotha to the present day, treats the state as an independent entity, a neutral instrument lying in the street, which the workers' party may pick up by winning an election and then employ against capital. A wealth tax here, a labor law there, a nationalized railway on Sunday. Each of these measures leaves untouched the presupposition of capital, the class which possesses nothing but its ability to work, selling its labor power to the possessors of the means of production. The relation survives every regulation, and surviving, resumes its hold upon the regulator. And this is no longer prophecy, it is 100 years of record. Social democracy has held office, alone or in coalition, in nearly every capitalist country of Europe, for decades at a time. It has commanded parliamentary majorities, central banks, nationalized industries, and treasuries beyond the dreams of any second international theorist. And in not one country, at not one hour, did capital cease to be the dominant social power. The reforms rose when capital was expanding and needed social peace, and were rolled back when capital contracted and demanded its pound of flesh. And it was social democratic ministers, again and again, who administered the rollback, the wage restraint, the austerity, the privatization, because the state they staffed remained the ideal personification of the total national capital, and its budget remained a function of capital's accumulation. This is Lenin's shell theorem verified by experiment. No change of persons, institutions, or parties within the shell can shake the power that possesses the shell. We say to the honest social democratic worker, your ministers did not betray you out of weak character. They executed the logic of the position they occupied. The state cannot be wielded against the relation of which it is the organ. It must be replaced, as the commune replaced it, by the organized power of the producers themselves. Part 7. The Dengist. We shall state the Dengist case fairly, in its author's own words, from the talk of June 30th, 1984, entitled Building a Socialism with a Specifically Chinese Character. Deng Xiaoping said, "The fundamental task for the socialist stage is to develop the productive forces." End quote. And further, capitalism can only enrich less than 10% of the Chinese population. It can never enrich the remaining more than 90%. But if we adhere to socialism and apply the principle of distribution to each according to his work, there will not be excessive disparities in wealth. Consequently, no polarization will occur as our productive forces become developed over the next 20 to 30 years. End quote, footnote 19. The theory, then, is this. Market relations, foreign capital, private profit, and wage labor may be admitted as instruments for developing the productive forces, while the Communist Party, holding the state, prevents these instruments from becoming a dominant social power. Capital in a birdcage. The state holds the cage, the bird sings, and does not escape. Observe, to Deng's credit as against his epigones, that he stated the theory as a falsifiable prediction, with a date attached. No polarization within 20 to 30 years. The 20 to 30 years have elapsed. The prediction can be checked. What does the check reveal? By 2021, the Hurun Global Rich List counted over $1,000 billionaires in the People's Republic of China, more than in any other country on earth, more than in the United States. Academic studies correcting the household surveys with those same rich lists estimate a wealth concentration among the highest of any major economy, with wealth Gini coefficients estimated between 0.6 and above 0.8. Footnote 20 gives the sources. A class of great proprietors of capital has arisen, numbering its wealth in trillions, and facing it stands the largest body of wage workers in human history, hundreds of millions strong, selling labor power to private and state employers who accumulate the surplus as capital. We pass no moral judgment, we take the measurement. Polarization occurred on the greatest scale ever observed within the very interval Deng named. Now, a scientific socialist, confronted with a falsified prediction, examines the theory that produced it. The theory was that the state, held by a communist party, would control the capital it had admitted. The result was the largest and fastest accumulation of private capital in the history of the world. What went wrong? Nothing went wrong. Capital behaved exactly as Marx, Engels, and Lenin said it must. It persisted. Therefore it grew. Growing, it became a social power, and as a social power, it set about taking hold of the society and the state that hosted it. At this point, the dengist reaches for Lenin. Did not Lenin himself introduce state capitalism, the new economic policy, concessions to foreign capital? He did, and we shall quote him exactly from Left-Wing Childishness and the Petty Bourgeois Mentality, May 1918. It has not occurred to them that state capitalism would be a step forward as compared with the present state of affairs in our Soviet Republic. If in approximately 6 months, time-state capitalism became established in our republic, this would be a great success. End quote, footnote 21. Observe 3 things. First, Lenin calls the thing by its name, capitalism. He does not baptize it socialism with Russian characteristics, nor call the market a neutral instrument. He says capitalism tolerated as a retreat in a ruined peasant country under armed proletarian power. Second, the time scale 6 months and later, under the new economic policy, he speaks of years, of a link between 2 epochs, never of a road of many decades along which capital would be nourished, enlarged, and merged into the world market. Third, and decisively, the class criterion. The retreat was conducted under a dictatorship of the proletariat, which had expropriated the great bourgeoisie, held the land nationalized, and kept for itself the monopoly of foreign trade. And even so, Lenin regarded the arrangement as a battlefield, not an equilibrium. The dengist's other favorite text is The Impending Catastrophe and How to Combat It of September 1917, where Lenin writes, "Socialism is merely the next step forward from state capitalist monopoly, or in other words, socialism is merely state capitalist monopoly, which is made to serve the interests of the whole people and has to that extent ceased to be capitalist monopoly." End quote. But read the sentences Lenin wrote immediately before, for they contain his test. Of the state directing the whole undertaking, he asks, in whose interest? Either in the interest of the landowners and capitalists, in which case we have not a revolutionary democratic but a reactionary bureaucratic state, an imperialist republic, or in the interest of revolutionary democracy, and then it is a step towards socialism. There is no middle course here. End quote. Footnote 22. There is no middle course. Lenin's own words forbid precisely the middle course which dengism claims to occupy. A state presiding for 40 years over a billionaire class and a proletariat of hundreds of millions, and calling the arrangement the primary stage of socialism. By Lenin's test, one must ask in whose interest the undertaking is directed, And to answer, one looks not at the Constitution's preamble, but at the accumulation. Who appropriates the surplus, whose wealth compounds, whose sons inherit? And here the whole argument closes like a ring. The dengist theory requires that the state hold the cage while the bird of capital sings inside it. But we have established from Engels the law. The economically dominant class, through the medium of the state, becomes also the politically dominant class. That law is not suspended by the color of the flag over the ministry, nor by the name of the party in whose building the personal link-up now holds its dinners. Where billionaires sit in the political consultative organs, where party secretaries' families hold equity, and equity holds party secretaries, where the state banks lend by the logic of accumulation, and the ministries legislate with one eye upon the flight of capital, there the link-up of Geidel's Berlin has reconstituted itself exactly as Lenin described it, and the question of who holds whom, the cage the bird or the bird the cage, is being answered by the method Marx taught, not by what the epoch says of itself, but by what it does. Poor Mr. Peel brought everything to Swan River except the relation. The dengist admitted the relation, and it is bringing everything else with it. Capital, wherever it persists, takes hold of the whole of society, including of the state. To believe one's own state exempt is not science. It is the oldest illusion of the state itself, the illusion of standing above society. A brief word suffices now for the liberal and the corporatist, for their case has already been buried under the texts. The liberal says, antitrust, central banking, an independent judiciary, and a free press will hold capital to the rules. But Engels has shown that their state is essentially a capitalist machine, the ideal personification of the total national capital. Its regulation is capital's self-administration, the total capital keeping order among its individual personifications, exactly as a league administers rules among its clubs, without ceasing to be the league of those clubs. What the liberal calls regulatory capture, and reports with eternal surprise on the front page of his newspaper, Lenin documented in 1916 as the personal link-up between the banks, industry, and the government, the normal structure, not the scandal, of the imperialist state. And the corporatist, whether of the tripartite or of the technocratic type, who dreams of chambers where state, employers, and labor harmonize the national interest, merely builds a chapel to the reconciliation of classes, the precise petty bourgeois theory which Lenin identified as the negation of Marxism on the state. The financial oligarchy dominates over the press and the government, wrote Lysis of the French Republic in 1908. Change the names, and the sentence reads as this morning's news in any capital of the imperialist world. Conclusion. What then is to be done with capital if it cannot be controlled? Marx answered in the 32nd chapter of Capital, in the passage that stands as the summit of the whole work. The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production, which has sprung up and flourished along with and under it. Centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. End quote, footnote 25. Not regulated, not caged, not guided through a primary stage of indefinite length. Expropriated. And Engels, in the passage we have already heard, names the only control which the modern productive forces admit. Society openly and directly taking possession of the productive forces which have outgrown all control, except that of society as a whole. Except that of society as a whole. There is the scientific answer to every controller, regulator, and cagekeeper. The productive forces in their capitalist form have outgrown every control except one, the association of the producers themselves, which controls them precisely by abolishing their existence as capital, as the alien power of a part of society over the whole of it. Let us end where we began and state the finding of this lecture in a single breath. Capital is not a thing but a social relation between persons, established by the instrumentality of things, the relation of wage labor and appropriated surplus, and as such an independent social power, the power of a part of society. The state is not an arbiter above the classes but the organ of the economically dominant class. And that class, through the medium of the state, becomes also the politically dominant class. Therefore, capital, wherever it persists, whatever the form of the state, whatever the name of the ruling party, takes hold of the whole of society, including of the state, and the project of controlling or regulating it, whether offered by the liberal, the corporatist, the social democrat, or the dengist, is refuted alike by the theory and by every decade of the experiment. The capitalist relation is not done away with by state ownership. It is brought to a head. Freedom consists in converting the state from an organ superimposed upon society into one completely subordinate to it, and that conversion begins where the capital relation ends, with the expropriation of the expropriators, the direct possession of the productive forces by the associated producers, and the dictatorship of the proletariat as the bridge to a society without classes and therefore without a state. That is what Marx really taught. Study the texts, they were written for you. Appendix of extended readings. Reading the first, The World Market as Compulsion. Those who imagine that a state may borrow the world market as a tool, while remaining outside its law, should hear how the Manifesto of 1848 describes that law. Marx and Engels write, "The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, that is, to become bourgeois themselves." End quote, footnote 27. On pain of extinction. Compulsion is the vocabulary, and it is exact. A state which sets its industries into competition upon the world market places them, and with them its working class, and finally itself, under the command of that market's imperative, accumulate at the world rate of exploitation, or be undersold. The policy autonomy which the cage theory presumes is precisely what the world market exists to dissolve. Reading the second, Engels against spurious socialism. To his analysis of state ownership, Engels attached a footnote which every revisionist should be made to copy out by hand. He writes, "But of late, since Bismarck went in for state ownership of industrial establishments, a kind of spurious socialism has arisen, degenerating now and again into something of flunkeyism, that without more ado declares all state ownership, even of the Bismarckian sort, to be socialistic. Certainly, if the taking over by the state of the tobacco industry is socialistic, then Napoleon and Metternich must be numbered among the founders of socialism." End quote. Footnote 28. Note what Engels is forbidding here. He is forbidding the juridical definition of socialism, the definition by title deed. Socialism is not a percentage of state ownership in the statistical yearbook, not a state sector, however, commanding its heights, not a 5-year plan for the profitability of state enterprises. Socialism is the abolition of the capital relation, the end of labor power as a commodity, of surplus labor as alien wealth. Measured juridically, a country may be painted any color. Measured by the relation, the question is answered in the factories, not in the property registry. And in the factories of every so-called market socialism, labor power is bought, surplus is appropriated, and the product confronts the producer as capital. Reading the third, the state's last independent act. From Anti-Duering, as quoted by Lenin, the first act by which the state really comes forward as the representative of the whole of society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, is also its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then dies down of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away. End quote, footnote 29. Consider what this passage does to the theory of the perpetual guardian state, the state which holds capital in trust for generations while the productive forces mature. In Engels' scheme, the state which has really taken possession in the name of society thereby begins to lose its reason for existence, because the class antagonism which necessitated it is being dissolved. A state which, 40 years on, grows ever mightier, ever more elaborate in its organs of surveillance and suppression, testifies by its own growth that the antagonism it manages is not dissolving but deepening. The scientific inference runs in one direction only. Where the state waxes, class antagonism persists. Where class antagonism persists under generalized wage labor, capital persists, and where capital persists, we have already seen what follows. Reading the fourth, what we propose instead. Let no one say this lecture ends in nothing but negation. The negation of the controller's state has a positive content, and Lenin states it. The state is a special coercive force. And he continues, the special coercive force for the suppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, of millions of working people by handfuls of the rich, must be replaced by a special coercive force for the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is precisely what is meant by abolition of the state as state. This is precisely the act of taking possession of the means of production in the name of society. End quote, footnote 30. Here is the whole difference between reform and revolution compressed into a sentence. The social democrat and the dengist alike would set the existing type of state, the organ standing above society, to the task of managing capital. The Marxist-Leninist replaces that type of state altogether, with the armed and organized working class, the commune state, the Soviet, whose function is not to regulate the capital relation but to suppress its bearers as a class, expropriate them, and administer production in common. That state does not negotiate with capital as a power, because its first act is to end capital's existence as a power. Reading the fifth, the new economic policy analogy, examined clause by clause. The dengist says, as Lenin retreated, so do we. Judge us as you judge him. Very well, let us apply the tests which Lenin's own texts supply, and which we quoted in Part 7. First test. Which class holds the armed power of the state, freshly forged in a revolution which expropriated the great bourgeoisie, or a party-state apparatus interlaced, through what Lenin called the personal link-up, with a billionaire class of its own cultivation? Second test. What has been expropriated? In Lenin's republic, the land nationalized, the banks and large-scale industry taken, the monopoly of foreign trade held as a fortress. Third test. What is the thing called? Lenin said capitalism, state capitalism, a retreat, a battlefield. He did not rebaptize the market as an eternal instrument or inscribe the primary stage into the party program for a century. Fourth test. What is the time scale? 6 months, he hoped, in 1918. A few years of NEP, contested at every step and reversed in fact within a decade. Against these 4 tests, the analogy does not limp, it collapses. And we may add the fifth, decisive test from the impending catastrophe. In whose interest does the accumulation run? Ask the rich lists of footnote 20. There is no middle course, said Lenin. There was none, and there is none. Reading the last, which is a charge to the listener. Do not take this lecture on trust. That would be the method of the icon makers, not of Marx. Take instead the reading program in this order. Begin with Wage Labor and Capital, an evening's reading where you will meet capital as a social relation for the first time. Proceed to the Manifesto and read it not as a hymn, but as an analysis of capital's conquest of the state and the world market. Then Engels, Socialism Utopian and Scientific, third part, for the state as ideal personification of the total national capital. Then The State and Revolution, with its long quotations, restoring what opportunism buried. Then Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, to see the personal link-up of bank, industry, and ministry documented from the bourgeoisie's own statistics. And then Capital itself, before which all commentary is small. Every text is on the Marxists' Internet Archive, without charge in the languages of the world. Check every quotation of this lecture against its source. Where the lecture and the text differ, burn the lecture and keep the text. For the conclusion of the whole matter is not a phrase to be repeated, but a task to be organized. Capital cannot be controlled by any state in any cage. It can only be abolished by the class which produces everything and owns nothing, organized as the ruling class. The texts were written for that class, that is to say, for you. End of lecture.